In this painting tutorial, we'll be checking out some clone troopers from Star Wars Legion. Welcome to Zorb Gaming, my name's Lachlan Linton Keane, and in this video we're going to be checking out a couple of paint schemes for the new clone troopers from the latest Star Wars Legion core set. Now the core set doesn't come out for a couple of weeks, we're hoping it'll be September, but it'll probably end up being sometime in October. But Fantasy Flight Games were kind enough to send me over a box so that I could get some painting tutorials and all sorts of other content ready for you guys so that it's all good to go for when you get your box at home. So today we're going to be diving into the clone troopers. Now of course these are Gen 1 clone troopers, so we're looking at a really monochromatic painting scheme, black and white basically, which as many of you at home probably know, it can actually be quite tricky. Sounds simple, but hard to execute well. So we're going to have a look at two different schemes today, one that relies more heavily on the new Games Workshop contrast paint range, and one that uses a couple of more traditional existing techniques like glazing to get a really nice effect. We're also going to have a look at some cool Geonosis basting so that we can get our guys ready to take the fight to the clankers on Geonosis and just have some absolutely fantastic units ready for the tabletop. So without further ado, let's jump into our first little paint scheme and we'll get these boys ready to go with some prime. So our first clone painting scheme today is going to be relying quite heavily on a really nice glaze to get some lovely recessed detail into our clone armor. But of course to do that we need a lovely prime underneath. So we're going to go for a nice bright white prime using the Tamiya Fine Surface Primer. So after we've got a nice smooth prime, the first thing we want to do is start working on our clone armor, and we're going to do that by hitting the model with a glaze. Now I'm going to mix up a glaze today using some Nuln oil, the famous Citadel black shade, and diluting that down with some Lahmian medium. Now make sure you give both of these paints a really good shake before you mix them up on the palette. Particularly Nuln oil likes to go a little glossy if all of its agents aren't well mixed, and then we're looking for about 50-50 Nuln oil to Lahmian medium. Now we can just apply this all over the model, and what we're looking for in a glaze is to not only get into all of that recessed detail like a normal wash, but to also tone all of the white flat areas. We'll start to get a really nice separation of pigment where we get less color on those top crisp highlights, and that kind of graduates down across the flat panels and then pools in our dark recesses, and it gives us some really nice shading and toning to what would otherwise be really boring flat panels. Now our next layer is going to be using the Citadel contrast paint Black Templar, and you'll notice that I'm diving straight into that without letting the Nuln oil glaze dry. And what we're doing here is using a technique called wet working. Now wet working is where we use a couple of different wet layers of paint to either combine pigment or to enable the flow of pigments. What we're going to do here is come in with our Black Templar and hit that into all of our really thick black areas like the underneath cloth and the visor, and we don't have to get really specific because the Nuln oil glaze is already there, and as we put the Black Templar down, the glaze will pull the Black Templar pigment in a bit of a capillary action and automatically take it right up to the edges of the white armor, which stops us from accidentally getting Black Templar all over the white armor, which is very painful to reverse. So we want to hit all of the large areas that we can do quite safely, so the back of the calves, the back of the thighs, the visor itself, we can just drop a dot of Black Templar into the middle of it, and the Nuln oil glaze automatically pulls it to the sides and gets a really nice looking visor. And we also want to get around the elbow joints and anywhere that we can safely get without compromising the white of the armor. We also want to hit all over the E11 blaster rifle, and we can use quite a thick coat of contrast there, really kind of relying on the traditional contrast method that will allow some lovely pooling to show off all of the recessed detail and give us some nice highlights, which we'll work on later to really get a lovely blaster finish. Now the final touch for getting all of our recessed details is to grab some straight Nuln oil and apply that into those really tiny nooks and crannies, like above the knee joint, around some of the hands and fingers, and along a couple of the arm joints. These are just a little bit too finicky for us to get in there with our Black Templar contrast because it would go all over the white, and the black Nuln oil is really perfect when it's neat to get in and darken those areas. We do still need to be careful because it isn't washed down as the glaze. It can still stain the white armor, but it just gives us a little bit more margin for error. Once that's all dry, you might notice that some of your broader flat areas might have thinned out a little bit too much, particularly on the back of the thighs, so I just come in here with another quick final layer of black Templar contrast. We don't have to worry about getting all the way up to the edges because all of that pigment's already done. It's just to thicken up that kind of big central zone that might have kind of gone to a lighter grey because of the saturation kind of variation from the contrast pigment, and that really kind of thickens it up, and it will blend all nicely because of the contrast effect. The final step for our black Templar contrast is to just grab a really fine detail brush, and we want to hit that thin rim that goes all the way around the Clone Trooper helmet. So I like to do this in 3 passes, one doing the flat side, one doing the top, and one doing the underneath, because you need to be really careful that you don't accidentally spill any of your black Templar contrast onto the clone helmet, because that's just irreversible. It means we'll have to go back to the start to try and clean up those areas, which is a huge pain. One particularly important area you want to preserve is the thin area of the white directly underneath the rim but above the visor. It's important to have that white there because it enables a separation which allows the visor to be really prominent and have a really striking feature on the helmet. Now once all that is completely dry, you can just leave the armor here. It looks pretty great, it's kind of grimy and shaded, and if that's the look that you're sort of going for, then by all means that can be your finished clone trooper. But I want my clones to be a little bit more new, a little bit hot off the press and ready to jump onto Geonosis for their first battle, so I'm going to start really focusing on brightening up that white with a dry brush. Now I'm going to use one of the Games Workshop dry paints, the Praxeti white, and we just get a little bit of that on the brush. We don't need to do as much as a normal paint, and then still try and remove most of it off onto some paper towel or some tissue paper, and then we're going to focus on all of the raised areas, hitting the back, hitting the kind of hard line armor joins on the knees, the elbows, the greaves, the shoulder pads, and just really give those white hard edges a nice crisp highlight, and it really makes the armor sing. Now the final layer of detail is to just grab some bolt gun metal or some chainmail from the Games Workshop Citadel metallic range, and we're just going to do a really nice dry brush over the E11 blaster rifle. We don't need to go too heavy here, just focus around the barrel on a couple of the raised details, just to give a little bit of a steely glint like the sun is catching the side of the E11 and really making it shine. Now to get our Clone Trooper based and ready to go in Geonosis, I'm just going to grab some Charred Brown from the Vallejo game color range. Rhinox Hide from Games Workshop would work just as well, and I'm going to hit that all over the base so that there's a nice even coverage. It'll probably take 2 coats to get around the rim nice and smooth. So now it's time to get our clone ready for Geonosis. Now we're going to be using the Mars Earth base ready product from the Luke's APS gaming range. All of these products are available over at zorpazorp.com, so you can go and check those out. First up, we're going to grab some of the Luke's APS Basting Glue. Now this is like a really sticky urethane glue. It's absolutely fantastic because when it dries it still stays sticky and proper sticky, not like PVA or hobby tack. It's really fantastic, which means your basing never comes off. So apply that all over the base. You can move it around with a toothpick or whatever, and then all you need to do is just dump the model down into a bucket of the base ready materials. This is the Mars Earth base ready, and it's got a really gorgeous mix of gravels and sands all in this beautiful red ochre, this lovely Marsy tone, which is a fantastic starting point for our Geonosis. Again, you could leave that here if you want, but I just want a little more kind of orangey yellow of that sandy color that we all know and love from Attack of the Clones, so I'm going to come in with some Plague Brown from the Vallejo game color range and just load that up on the brush, pull most of it off, and we're just going to do quite a nice heavy dry brush all over the gravel and the stones as well, really picking out all of those raised details, and this adds a little bit more contrast to the base as well, so it's not so flat, and it also brings in some of our orange toning. We're also going to take a little bit of this paint and kind of quite heavily dry brush with some dry paint, make sure there's not too much wet paint left on the brush, and hit all of the rim of the base, and that way you won't get any brush strokes, and that really helps kind of blend it all together, and it's just going to look fantastic when they're sitting on a board that is similarly Geonosis themed. Now the final little touch is we're just going to grab some khaki from the Vallejo game color range, and once again just load up in a little dry brushing fashion and just hit the very tops of the rocks and a little bit of the gravel just to give a little subtle highlight as if the sun is kind of glaring down on the Geonosis dusty plains, and it gives our basing a little bit of kick that really brings it to life. So that's our first clone trooper finished, and I'm really happy with how that scheme's turned out. For our next scheme, we're going to be focusing more heavily on using the Games Workshop contrast range. So I'm going to prime our next clone trooper, a sergeant in this case, with the Wraithbone contrast primer. I've chosen the Wraithbone over the Grey Seer because I really want to try and get a nice bright armor that's got a lot of vibrancy to it, and the Wraithbone always looks better for vibrant colors. Now our first layer is going to be very similar to our glaze in that we're going to be treating the whole model as one to really get a bit of shading into that white and really set up that recessed detail, and we're going to be using the contrast paint Apothecary White. Now it's really important with all the contrast paints, but particularly with Apothecary White, that you shake the crap out of it. I really kind of get a brush in there and dig it around because there's a lot of kind of separation of pigment that pulls around the bottom of the tin, and you want this really well mixed, otherwise the contrast agents won't act properly. I really quite like a lot of the contrast paints, a lot of them are really effective, but I found that Apothecary White, which let's face it is basically a grey, isn't particularly great when it's used neat out of the paint pot. So what I like to do is thin it down with a little bit of that contrast medium. Now the way that the whole medium and contrast system works is that they allow pigment to show through from the layers underneath, and that's how you kind of get the bright vibrancy. Now because the contrast Apothecary White is quite a grey paint, by thinning it down we're allowing more of that graduation of color in the top spectrum, the lighter end of the spectrum, to come through by allowing that prime to come through, and we'll get more of a bright white. So I thin it down with about 50-50 contrast medium to Apothecary White and apply that liberally all over the model. Now unlike our Nuln oil glaze, we're just going to let the Apothecary White layer completely dry, and this is really important because the contrast agents need to do all their pooling and all of their contrasting magic undisturbed, so we're going to let that completely dry and then come in with some Citadel contrast Black Templar, just like we did in the last paint scheme. We're going to be focusing on all of those black undergarments. We've got to take specific care here because we don't have the wet working to do the hard work for us, so make sure that we don't get any kind of details on that white armor, or that will be very tricky to remove. Now while we've got our Black Templar contrast out, we also want to hit all of our weapons, and of course we've got the Sergeant here, so he's got a bit of a black binoculars there as well, and we've also got a nice sash for his binoculars that we're going to use the black contrast on as well. You could also use something like the Basilicanum Grey or even a brown leather strap if you wanted to bring some different tones in, but I really want to stick in that like stark, contrasty, black and white, monochromatic kind of scheme, so I'm going to use black for the sash as well. We can also grab our fine detail brush and just do our nice work on the fine rim around the helmet while we've got the Black Templar out, and then we're going to grab some pure Nuln oil and do a little bit of wet blending between the contrast that's down and the Nuln oil to just flow into those recessed details. Once again, we need to be careful that because this isn't diluted like the glaze, this will stain the white armor, so particularly around the knee joints and things where we're getting some very fine kind of recessed detail, just make sure we don't spill over onto any of the white paneling. Just as before, we need to wait for all of those layers to completely dry to bring in our dry brushing layer. We're going to be using Praxeti White just like before, but we've got a bit of a different technique here. Because the Citadel Contrast Apothecary White is very grey, our dry brush needs to do a lot of heavy lifting compared to our glazing layer to make sure that we get that nice white overtone. So we're going to be doing quite a heavy dry brush, load up our Praxeti White onto our brushes before, and still take the vast majority of the paint off, but we're going to be really focusing on not just the raised areas but also some of the flat areas and getting a lot of kind of pigment deposition to really make that sheen and really grab that nice white bright armor. You might need to do this in kind of a couple of layers, a couple of passes to make sure that you still don't get it on the black undergarments, and you just need to take your time and really work over it, and you'll get that nice dry brush to bring in the white tones that makes the white armor really sing. Now with our clone armor finished, as always, we've just got a couple of little steps left. We're going to grab our chainmail or our bolt gun metal and do a nice dry brush all over our E11 blaster rifle that the sergeant's got there in his hand. Obviously the special and heavy weapons in the rest of the squad are exactly the same. You just might need to do a little bit more attention to the various barrels and make sure that you get all of the silver detailing in the right place. If you want to add a little bit more recessed detail to those special weapons, you can always come by with a pass of neat Nuln oil and apply that that all over the weapon as well. Now once that's down, we're just going to do the exact same basing method that we did for the first scheme, putting down our Charred brown and then the Luke's APS Basting Glue and our Mars earth. I like to do a little bit of variety across the whole squad, having some of the models having a lot of gravel, some of them only having a few little rocks and different bits and pieces, but keeping it, you know, nice and unified with the basic material, but just adding some little sparks of detail with a little bit of variation across the base. Then once again, we'll just grab our Plague brown and our Khaki to put in those nice Geonosian overtones with some dry brushing, and then we've got our second clone scheme all finished and ready to take to Geonosis. So there we have our two alternate schemes for our clone troopers. Now personally, I think I prefer the first one because for my army, I like the idea that they're a bit cleaner, and I really like the kind of smooth finish that I was able to achieve with the glazing. I think that's got a really nice graduation of color that tones the armor beautifully and still gets some really nice highlights with the Praxeti white dry brush. Whereas for me, because the Apothecary white isn't white enough, I had to do so much heavy lifting with the dry brush that those have kind of, I guess, I'm just not a fan of the overall texture. But to be honest, that's just a personal choice. The armor just looks a lot more weathered and worn, and if you're looking for some more battle kind of damaged clones or some more kind of filthy, they've been out in the grime and the fight a little bit longer, that technique could work perfectly for you. I just like my boys to look a little bit more, you know, they're hot off the press. They've just jumped out of the factory and into their lat gunship, and they're off to Geonosis to fight in their first battle. So it'll be scheme number one for me for the rest of the troopers, but that is purely aesthetics, and you guys can do whatever you like the most. So there we have it, guys, some fantastic Gen 1 clone troopers ready to take the fight to the clankers. I hope that was helpful for you guys. If there was any kind of extra stuff you'd like to know, just drop it down in the comments below. And remember, you can get all of those basing materials over at zorbazorb.com. I'll link that down in the description. I'm going to have a similar tutorial coming out for the clankers and all the extra units that we get in the core sets. We've got the droids themselves, we've got droidicas, we've got the Bark Speeder as well for the clones, and of course General Kenobi and General Grievous as well. So lots of cool Legion painting tutorials on the horizon, so stay tuned for those. And then of course we'll be diving into some more epic Legion content. We're going to have a big juicy narrative campaign, very exciting stuff on the horizon, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you're new around here. If you've got any questions, just leave them down in the comments, and we'd love if you give the video a like. It really helps us out. Make sure you check out all the other content we've got here on the channel. We've got a little bit of Legion stuff, and we've got a lot of Middle Earth and lots of painting tutorials and terrain tutorials, so there's lots of goodies to dive into. But in the meantime, we will see you next time here on Zorbazorb Gaming. Thanks so much for watching.